Hello, and thanks for joining me. In this video, we'll take a look at how to show distance in your digital artwork. Now, when you're creating any type of digital artwork, if you're going for realism, you're going to want to do a number of things to achieve that, and one of them is to try to show distance. And you can do that in a number of ways. It's kind of a combination of a bunch of different things. You can see in this example here, the how in the background is a little bit fainter, and what's in the foreground here is much darker and stands out more, and it kind of gives this appearance of distance. So if we have some objects here and we want to try to set them apart, push one back and bring another forward, we have to do a number of different things. The first one we can use is focus. So we'll try that. Focus is basically your eye focusing on an object. So if you're looking at something in the foreground, something that's in front of you, like if you hold your hand up to your face, for instance, and focus on it, whatever is behind you or behind your hand will get blurrier and it'll become more out of focus. And the further away something is, the less in focus it is, unless you're focusing on it. So that's one way you can show distance. And if we do that in our example here, we'll use one of the blur tools. A good way to achieve focal effects is by blurring. And there's a lot of good brushes here in the blenders that you can use for blurring. So you want to achieve distance by having things that are further away be blurrier and things that are closer be sharper. So we'll have this dot in the distance be the furthest away, and we'll be focusing on the foreground dot here. So I'm going to blur the background dot, then I'm going to blur the next one slightly less, and even less on the middle one. And now you get this kind of effect of these dots here being distant. Now, distance is accomplished by a number of things in combination. So sometimes you can get away with just using the focus, but if you want to further enhance the distance, you need to add one more of these steps or more. So color would be the next one, and depending on what color your object is originally and what color your environment is and a lot of other different factors, changing your color is a way to establish distance. Now, our background is kind of this light blue color, so that's going to be our environment color. And so we'll use a little bit of that environment color to lighten this background dot here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to paint over it a little bit. I'm going to turn on preserve transparency first. Lighten it, and you can see it appears more distant. And if I do the same thing to the rest of these, they also become distant. And the one that's in front is, of course, darker. Now, these things need to be spread out evenly. You want your most distant objects to be the lightest and the blurriest, and then what's in the foreground is generally the sharpest and the darkest. And that's not always the case, but most of the time. And it kind of depends on what you're making, so don't always follow that rule. But for the most part, when I'm doing a landscape and it's in the daytime and it's a blue sky, I'm doing something kind of like this to achieve distance. Now, gradients, of course, can achieve distance too, and there's kind of a gradient here of focus, and there's a gradient of color. And what a gradient is a gradient is this background here that you can see is a gradient. It kind of starts out dark here, it gets light here, and it's everything in between. So each one of these little segments gets lighter and lighter and lighter. That's a gradient. So you want to have an even gradient most of the time. So you want to make sure that your dot in the middle or your object in the middle isn't more blurry than the dot that's furthest away. You want everything to get more blurry or less blurry kind of linearly. Same thing with your color. So you want there to be a gradient. You don't want it to go blurry, sharp, blurry, sharp. You know, that's going to make a kind of weird focal effect that you might not want. The next thing that we can look at is a little more advanced here. We'll take a look at some patterns that we can use. So I have everything here in this landscape kind of on its own layer. These trees are on a layer, and the land is on a layer, and the hills, and so on. So right now this land is all one color, and we could of course use a gradient to establish the distance using color. So we'll do that. We'll have the foreground be a little bit darker, and the background can be a little bit lighter, and you can see we've kind of already established this distance by making this gradient. Now I'm making sure that this end of the gradient, the bottom end, is always darker than the top end. Now of course if you have it switched the other way around, it would be fine to have the top darker and the bottom lighter. But what I'm getting at again is that it goes from dark to light. It doesn't kind of jump around and go dark and then a little bit of light and then somewhere in between, because if you do something weird like this, it's going to give it this rippling effect, and you might not want that. So there's a linear gradient here. That's establishing some distance, and then we'll put some texture or a pattern on it to establish more of a sense of distance. Now any pattern that's going off into the distance is going to follow a perspective, and perspective is basically anything that's really far away is generally going to get smaller and get flatter and kind of squished. So your patterns and anything else that you want to look realistic needs to fit into this perspective. So our pattern needs to be broader in the foreground, maybe something like this. And then we need to shrink our brush size so that our pattern gets smaller and the shapes in the pattern get closer together. And what that's doing is that's giving a sense of distance by the pattern or the texture changing. And again, there's a gradient here. There's a gradient going from larger texture size and evenly shrinking down to a smaller texture size. The shapes in this texture are very broad and very spaced out towards the bottom, but as you get towards the top, they get compressed together and they get smaller, as does anything that's going that's getting further away from you in perspective. So these trees, for instance, here that I have on this layer, the tree that I want to appear furthest away is much smaller than the tree that I have in the foreground, and this sense of scale is also kind of giving us some perspective here. The spacing makes a difference too with the trees as well. You would want trees that are closer to the background to be closer together and ones that are in the foreground to be further apart. As far as landscapes go, you can use a bit of atmospheric coloring to establish distance, and similar to how we did here with these dots by making them lighter, you can do that with objects in your landscapes. So these hills, for instance, if we wanted these hills to look lighter, we can always add more of this background sky color, and they get further and further away until they're almost too distant to see. And we can also blur them if we want to, using the blur brush to make them look more distant. Now you got to be careful using this brush, and this is a good example here of why. See how it added this weird fringe around the edge? This is kind of a bug in Corel Painter, in all versions of Painter, and there's really not much you can do about it other than avoid it or try to prevent it by using some different tricks. So one thing you can do here is you could change the composite method from default to multiply, but that will kind of change your color. You might not want that. You could also, after you've done your blurring, turn on preserve transparency and then sample your original color here and then just use it to paint over that fringe. And this is how it should look when you use the blur brush. It shouldn't add that fringe, but it does. So I recommend, if you're going to do any blurring, do it before you do any shading to your object, or wait until your artwork's completely finished and then do all your blurring on your artwork that's just a flattened layer. On this hills layer, we'll use a little bit of a color gradient here, and sometimes it's nice, especially for hills and mountains, to lighten the bottom of it so there's a gradient from light to dark as you go up. So kind of painting along the bottom of these hills here, making a little bit of a gradient like that, that kind of helps achieve some distance within just the mountain itself. You get a sense that there's a certain amount of distance happening from the top of the mountain, and then as it's coming towards you, you get some distance there. And the atmosphere would kind of block some of the light there and change it a little bit. So what we're going for here is some kind of natural light effects. A lot of this, the reason why this happens is just due to how light works and how the eye deals with light. Let's go to our trees layer and let's pick a tree color, something other than black. Let's make it this brown color here. Maybe we'll go a little bit darker. Go like that for our tree color, and then if we want our foreground tree to be a little bit closer to us, we'll make it darker. We'll fill it in with that color. So now there's a sense of distance because the trees are kind of a similar color. They're kind of monochromatically the same color, but one is darker than the other, and that gives a sense of distance. Now, as I mentioned before, if you want to do some blending, you probably want to do that last, and you want to do it with a piece of flattened artwork. So I'm going to do that here. I'm going to go to Layers, Drop All, and then I'm going to take my blur brush and I'm going to blur some different things. I'm going to blur this background, sand or land or whatever it is, because I don't want it to be so sharp. And you can see that's really making it look more distant now, like it's out of focus. This almost gives you the effect that you would get when you're taking a photograph. I'm going to blur this tree a little bit to make it look more distant. I'm trying to avoid stuff that's in the foreground, and I'm trying to blur less and less as I come into the foreground. So I'm trying not to blur this tree if I can help it, because I want it to appear closer. Now I have somewhat of a sense of focus here that I can keep playing with. Ideally, you want the objects that are more distant to have less detail, and you want the objects that are closer to have more detail. So when you're painting in details on this tree, you could feel free to go in here and draw all kinds of little twigs and creases and cracks and put moss on it and stuff. But for this background tree, just kind of shade it just a little bit and don't worry about really going in and trying to add a lot of detail to it, because if you do, you're going to make it look too close and too sharp. So save your fine details for the foreground objects and keep your background objects a little more rough and simple. That'll help it look better. Another thing that you can do to really help establish where something is you can use overlap. This tree is overlapping the mountains and it's overlapping the ground, so we know that it's closer to us. But if there was any question about where this tree is versus this tree, we can always have one overlap the other, and this is an extreme example here. I'll just put a really long branch out here, but now you can see that it makes it more clear that one tree is in front of the other because they're overlapping, like so. Now, to get into the more technical aspects of light, when you're closer to your light source, which, if we're talking about daylight, might be the sun. If we're closer to the sun here, the light's going to be brighter and more intense where you're closer to the sun. So the hue or the color of the light is probably generally going to be warmer, assuming that the light source is a warm colored light source. And then as you get further away, it's going to shift cooler and get more towards blue. So what I like to do is in the foreground, I like to make what's in the foreground darker, more desaturated, more towards gray, and a little more blue or cooler. And we can achieve that by making a sort of vignette here. And with this vignette, it'll just kind of cool off the foreground here, and you get a good sense of distance just by using that. Now, if we added some warmer color here to the foreground, we might get more of a sense of that being closer to the sun there. So, for instance, with these two trees, this tree here is a bit cooler and a bit darker if we sample the color. It's more towards the red. And in a sense of hue, one hue, let's say yellow and red, one is obviously a little bit brighter and warmer, and one's a little bit cooler. So I'm kind of going by that. If you want to learn more about color theory and all this complicated color stuff, you can watch my video on color theory. But basically, if it's in the foreground, it should be a little bit cooler, and if it's in the background, closer to the light source, it should be warmer. And you can see that it shifts from an orange to a red. It's just a little bit of a shift in the hue, but that definitely helps. If we go down here into this area that we made more blue, you can see it cools off quite a bit. When we get up towards the sun, it's warmer. And then in between, it just kind of does that gradient. It kind of transitions in. So in the foreground, closer to light, more vivid, more saturated in this kind of area here. And in the background, desaturated, darker, cooler. And that'll give you some really good distance effect. So I hope that was helpful and gives you an idea of how you can add some realism and some depth and distance to your digital artwork. If you have any questions, feel free to comment on this video. And if you found this information helpful, take a quick second to like this video on YouTube, and that'll make it easier for other artists out there to find this information. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for my next video.